All right.
All right. Thank you guys all for joining us today. We're going to be doing BMP conversion for AMD refurbishment, and we have Tim Denicola here from CEC, who's going to be doing the presentation. Mr. Denicola has been with CEC for 9 of his 18 years in the industry. He has a BS in chemistry from Clarion and a master's in geology from West Virginia. So welcome, Tim, and
Thank you.
started.
Thank you very much. Over the years, I attended a lot of presentations at conferences, and every once in a while, you'll see a presentation about converting existing systems to a new style of system. I never got to do one until about 2022 when the client asked us to look at some work that had been done in the 90s and look for potential improvement opportunities on it. So this was the first refurbishment I've done where we actually had to convert the treatment technologies. The project itself is the Coons Run watershed of Harrison and Marion Counties, West Virginia. It's depicted in the top right of the image where the red star is. That's the project location. It's part of the larger West Fork River watershed. The Coons Run watershed, it's not huge, 6.5 miles in length, 6 square miles, but pretty much entirely acid mine drainage, alkaline mine, abandoned mine drainage contaminated. It is Clean Water Act 303D listed for pH and metals with TMDLs listed down at the bottom. Now, TMDLs are taken over as an average over the year, but I broke them down to daily rates, which is not truly applicable, but just to give you some feel later in the presentation, I get into the daily rates from the contaminant sources. So these are what the daily rates would be for the TMDL compliance, about 15 pounds per day iron, 7.8 pounds per day aluminum, 12 pounds per day manganese. So an impacted watershed. The area is heavily mined. It's all Pittsburgh coal bed. I mean, there's probably some stripping on the Redstone. I don't see too much Swickley out there, but the Pittsburgh's the dominant coal bed. The areas of interest on this particular project were the Francis mine, mined by Montfair Gas and Coal Company. Interestingly, they were housed out of Fairmont, and I've actually seen this pretty regularly in my career, where you just switch the word and you have a new company. So yeah, Montfair Gas and Coal mined this from about the 1900s to 1960s. The site was surface mined and underground mined. Even though these shape files don't show the project site itself being stripped, it was all stripped. All of that was stripped out of there. If I had a little more time, I would have updated those shape files to be a little bit more accurate. In this depiction, in this image, the Coons Run is flowing from south to north. That's the main stem. And the unnamed tributary to Coons is coming across the project site from east to west. So the project history, it predates my existence in this industry. The initial site assessments were performed in '94 when I was about 11 or 12 years old. Initial chemistry out there was acidic. pH is in the 3 to 4 range. Acidity in the anywhere from moderate to high range, hundreds to 300s. Iron in the moderate to high range, 30s, 60s. Aluminum was low except for site S6 and S7, and we to this day don't know exactly where these sites were. This has been lost to history, but we've seen a couple of aluminum spikes out there in these early days in '94. So the initial reclamation actually occurred in 1997. It consisted of a fairly large refuse reclamation, or I should say AML reclamation, in addition to AMD remediation. So refuse, high walls, portals, anoxic limestone drains, settling ponds, and compost limestone beds. We were very fortunate that the client thoroughly documented the construction of this project, and we have the pictures from '97. So here we have our refuse reclamation. Picture on the left was a large refuse pile right along the Coons Run main stem. You can see the discoloration in the main stem, not only from the refuse pile, but from other sources in the watershed. On the right is the project site itself. Now, I call that refuse, and there is refuse in there, but there's a lot of spoil in there too. We've done geotechnical and geochemical analysis because we wanted to use that as borrow material on our current project. And we got pretty low hits on pyritic sulfur. I mean, it's definitely contaminated material, but there's a lot of just sandstone, siltstone style overburden in addition to the refuse. We got the high wall grading and portal closures. So we had some pretty substantial high walls out there. Again, we didn't, I didn't, but in the early days. So there was a lot of high wall grading and portal closures. You could see some of the open mine entry plumbing schematics for draining the water out into what was ultimately constructed, which were ALDs. This is where we started getting into passive AMD remediation. So You have your AML component with your grading and your portal closures. Then you have your AMD remediation component where you're capturing your water from the mine pool, taking it out to treatment. So these were massive ALDs. I mean, they follow the contour of this strip mining around the entire property. The depths, the widths, I don't have exact dimensions, but just visualizing it here, these were massive ALDs. What's funny is I've seen ALDs throughout my career. They typically didn't work too effectively, but to this day, these ALDs are still fairly operational. And then those ALDs drained into more typical, more familiar passive AMD treatment components like settling ponds to allow for the oxidation of the ALD treated water, and then a series of compost limestone beds to just kind of finish it off and facilitate additional load reductions. So this was the 97 construction project, and this is what the original treatment system basically looked like. You got the anoxic limestone drains depicted as those shape files along the contour of the mine. Now they're somewhat estimated here. We don't have the original files, but we've been told working with the client that they basically hug the mine outcrop, the coal outcrop, and they have multiple outlet points. So we have one outlet into the third pond and two of them outlet into the first pond. And then once the ALD's outlet into the ponds, there's a combination of the settling ponds and compost limestone beds. But you could already see some potential issues here. Short circuiting, preferential flow paths, ferrous hydroxide precipitates instead of ferrous instead of ferric precipitates. So all of this leads up to why we were initially asked to go out there, do a site assessment, and propose some additional treatment methodologies. Oh, and I should point out that the treatment surface area is approximately 3 acres. And there's an additional 2 acres for a total of 5 that are disturbed to the point that the landowner can't use them. There's some steep slopes, surface diversion ditches. So in addition to just pond surface area, there's a lot of other features that make this land unusable. That original AMD treatment system had a pretty substantial history of water quality monitoring. So these are the water quality monitoring locations. With red is what we consider the influent. It's from the ALDs. There's no way to get the chemistry going into the ALDs at this point. I mean, there's a couple boreholes into the mine. They're long forgotten. We didn't sample them. It'd be interesting to see what the mine pool looks like, but we treated the ALD effluent as our source into our proposed treatment system. So the red is our influent, yellow are treatment system and watershed sampling points. The data was collected pretty consistently from 98 to 2010, and there was about a decade lull. And the client started collecting again in 2019 through 21 when they had determined that there would be a need for a refurbishment out here. And again, in this image, the blue line is the unnamed Trib to Coons Run, flowing from east to west. So some of the original data from the, not original from the initial site assessment, but original from the first treatment system. I didn't get to include everything I wanted to, but for the most part, we're looking at pH here. In the early days, the pH from the ALDs was ranging from about 5.5 to 6.5 pH. Each color represents a different ALD. So you can see like the blue, which was ALD 600, it was consistently in the 6 range, but the red, which looks like ALD 200, it struggled a little more in the early days, but over time you can see there was a trend towards pHs in the 6 and higher range. 20 years later, you can kind of see the groupings of the intensity of sampling too, 98 to 02, and then 05 to 2010, and then, again in the late teens, early 20s. And then the total iron was coming in the early days. There were some 0 irons coming in from a few of the ALDs. It's all being accumulated in those ALDs, but some of them were still discharging in the 25 to 35 milligram per liter range. And there was a kind of a trend of it dropping off over 20 years where we were getting concentrations in the 5 to 20 milligram range by the early 2020s. And approximately 85% of that iron in the ALD was coming out as ferrous. We were fortunate that the initial data set did do some speciation, and we could see that we were looking at a lot of ferrous, low oxygen ferrous iron. So, this was all about improvements to the watershed, and we're looking at the efficacy of the treatment system. So the load reductions, iron load in, iron load out. In the early days, iron load in blue was a lot higher. We had higher iron. Really, I don't know about the flows. We had higher iron. Well, whether it was the iron concentration or the flow that caused those high loads, I think it was the iron concentration because the flow has been pretty consistent for 20 years. And then the red line represents the loads out. And you can see that the load in has been decreasing and the load out's been fairly consistent for 20 years. the lower graph shows just the total iron load reduction. In the early days in 98, early 2000s, we had an average load reduction of about 80% iron removal. But as we got closer to the 2020s, we were getting down near 2022. Now the upper graph, the trend line kind of skews the lower graph because, the upper graph makes it look like, you're getting almost all your iron out by 2022 because you have a lower load coming in, the same load going out. But that trend line actually comes in below the actual data points. So we were really looking at about 40-50% load reduction by 2022. So, it was still treating, it was still removing iron, but it was doing it to a lesser extent with each passing decade. So I guess I kind of summarized my points to the right there about the influent always exceeded the watershed TMDL, but the effluent periodically would actually meet the TMDL and discharge an iron load that was within compliance. Now, it wasn't consistent, but it did occasionally happen. And we did see that progressive decline in iron load, and we did see that decline in iron performance or iron reduction over time. And if I had a little more time, I'd like to run a few more statistical tests, like principal component analysis of just the effluent to see how it changed over 20 years, which parameters covaried, and what time of the season and what year. Do you see higher loads in the spring or fall, or do you see higher loads early in the treatment history or later in the treatment history, to try to hone in? Is this seasonal fluctuations, annual fluctuations, decreased treatment performance fluctuations? And I think getting into some of the statistical interpretations would answer those questions. And with more time, I'll probably run those analyses. So the original treatment system, the impacts on the watershed. Picture on the left is the unnamed tributary upstream of the site. Picture in the middle is the unnamed tributary downstream of the site, and then the picture on the right is the Coons Run main stem. All of them, well, except for the upstream image, the center and right image of the UNT downstream and the Coons Run main stem are obviously iron contaminated. Not so much in Coons Run because of dilution from other healthier water sources, plus attenuation. This is alkaline water. There's a lot of iron in that trib, but it's still precipitating in the trib. So even by the time the trib meets the main stem, the tributary itself has become a sink for iron attenuation, which is not necessarily a good thing. But so we get to the actual project, the proposed treatment system, the proposed AMD refurbishment. Now, don't mind the gradient on this. I just put this together very early in the project history. These are all basically oxic beds. The color gradient's just to indicate the decreasing iron concentrations as you move through. So basically a series of oxidation beds with spillways, but they weren't just spillways, they were spillways with boulder cascades in between them to kind of facilitate aggressive drops, agitation, oxidation steps, try to, exsolve CO2 and train O2 to the extent possible with very minimal vertical relief across this property. The driving force behind this entire refurbishment had nothing to do with load reductions. I mean, yeah, sure, the load reductions had decreased from 80% to 40% over 20 plus years, but the real driving force was the landowner. A new landowner had bought this property a few years ago and basically said, I'm bulldozing those ponds. I'm a farmer. I have cattle. I'm running them up there. I don't want this here anymore. So that was the landowner's objectives: reduce the footprint. He'd like to use the land for agricultural grading. He'd also like road access and exclusionary fencing and other features that were beneficial to him. And the client's objectives were to try to achieve equal treatment as the existing condition by adjusting our treatment technologies, but leaving the ALDs intact, because digging into those would be a major undertaking. And the data had shown that they were still discharging alkaline water. So we treat this as an alkaline mine water discharge, even though deeper in the mine pool it may very well be acidic. Now, I apologize for the next slide. It's a little wordy, but these are just some of the design details. Was to design a series of shallow oxidation beds and throw a limestone bed in there and a couple aerobic wetlands in there for various purposes. Reduce a 3-acre treatment footprint to about a ½ acre, so an 80% reduction. Maintain iron loads and limit the use of compost BMPs. This was the biggest change right here. Limit the use of compost BMPs and really focus on oxidation facilitating BMPs. Keep the ALDs, design shallow ponds, build the boulder cascades. We threw a flushing limestone bed in there, even though the site is net alkaline. We had about 300 milligrams per liter of alkalinity, but we had, potential acidity, metals acidity, hot acidity titration showing numbers in like the low hundreds. So the alkalinity offsets the acidity. But this is happening at whatever the kinetic rate allows it to happen. And we were kind of concerned that even with the residual alkalinity, with all that iron oxidizing and precipitating, we may see a pH drop by the end of the treatment system. So we just threw a limestone bed about midpoint just to sweeten it up with a little additional alkalinity, and then some aerobic wetlands at the tail end for physical filtration of suspended solids. And then, other just typical engineering features with maintenance bypass, valves, vaults, drains, so we could isolate each BMP for maintenance purposes, and then regrading the agricultural fields for the landowner's beneficial use. So these are just a couple more of those details. So what we have here is the dark line is the proposed grade. The lighter colored line is the existing grade. That weird trapezoidal shape is the presumed location of the ALD. But you can see how the landowner kind of lost access to that bottom land, getting closer to the tributary, steep slopes, large ponds. His access road was kind of in there somewhere, and then it dropped off into the trib. So we basically proposed to give that back to him with a series of grades of 4.5 to 1 to 6.5 to 1, depending on the location. Roadside stormwater collection ditch, proposed access road, proposed treatment pond, and then unnamed tributary to Coons Run. So kind of compressing this and giving him back what he wanted. And then the oxidation beds themselves, they're shallow. They're very simple, probably some of the simplest beds we ever designed, because there's no plumbing, there's no limestone, it's just an oxidation bed. It's shallow. I would like them to have been a little broader, but broader would have consumed more land area. So they're kind of long and narrow. I can live with that. We used rock baffles in them to try to distribute flow across their entire width. Otherwise, we would have just been designing something that was already there. And then we used the Redgate Valve Company pinch valves, which I've really grown to love because they have a nylon sleeve that actually gets pinched shut so that the AMD is never in contact with the actual mechanisms of the valve itself, because I've seen a lot of valves foul on these treatment sites. And that the client had requested each of these valves be accessible. So we installed basic standard engineering precast concrete manholes and housed each valve within a manhole. A lot of times I just put them in an 18-inch HDPE pipe that's just like a shallow vault. But, if you ever need to get to it, you need to excavate it out. And the client didn't want to have to excavate these valves, so they could actually access every single one of them through these precast structures. So we had run a couple theoretical models. So what do we expect to see for treatment efficacy with our proposed treatment system with the series of oxic beds, throwing the occasional limestone bed in there? This was based on 22 years of data that we had been provided by the client. So the top table is what type of treatment efficacy we'd expect under average conditions. What you basically have to see here is that the first AMD source, or 3 of the AMD sources, comes into pond 1, but then a 4th source comes in pond 3, and that's what that auxiliary number is off to the side. So under average conditions, we have iron coming in at 16 milligrams per liter by pond 3 at 6.5. But then we have another source coming in, pushing it back up to 10.5. But then we got 2.5 hours of retention on our proposed pond, which drops it back down to 3.4. And by the end of the treatment system, there is no iron. We have 100% load reduction. But as you're aware, passive treatment systems are subject to environmental factors. So what if the temperature's low? What if the DO's low? What if the flow's higher? What if the pH drops? How's that going to affect our treatment efficacy? So we also used AMD Treat's prior version, and we adjusted those average and maximum conditions. And what we saw is if we had iron coming in at about 21 milligrams per liter, which was a typical maximum, it only drops to about 21.06. Then another source comes in, kicks it back up, and then it drops through the next ponds, but we're still at 13.54 milligrams per liter in our final effluent. So we're only looking at about a 36% load reduction under extreme conditions. And it was important that we set this tone early in the project. I mean, people needed to understand that this is a substantially reduced footprint with a different treatment technology under variable conditions. Sometimes you'll see excellent treatment efficacy and sometimes you won't. And it was important to set that understanding early. So where did we end up? Our refurbished AMD treatment system. And mind, these pictures were all taken while this was still in construction. So there's a lot that still needed cleaned up, touched up, tied in, vegetated, stabilized. But this is where we were at whenever these photos were taken. This just got kind of wrapped up over the summer, and it's still not even technically wrapped up yet. But on the left is basically our grading plan showing the series of ponds, flushing beds, aerobic wetlands at the end, the regraded agricultural fields. And on the right is an actual photo from pond 1 looking down the length of the treatment system. That's the 3 of the mine water sources tied into a single pipe coming in right there. Then we get to pond 3 looking up gradient, back towards where that last picture had been taken. You can see the agricultural fields on the right being graded back in. And you can see the former refuse and spoil reclamation areas that had been excavated to obtain the borrow material we needed to fill in 5 acres of ponds. And then pond 5 looking down gradient as we're getting farther down. On the left of that photo is those reclaimed ag fields. It looks steep in that photo, but it's really not. It's gently enough sloping that the landowner can run cattle for grazing purposes on it. Preliminary data. And when I say preliminary data, I am talking preliminary data. I mean, I was out there for a site meeting and was just snagging data wherever I could while I was holding an unrelated site meeting. So we have a lot to refine here, but the preliminary data shows that pond 1, we don't even have a pH, but I did get the pH of the AMD source. It was coming in at about 5.9 something. And pond 2, the pH was already up to 6.2, likely because of the residual alkalinity, the exsolving of CO2, a number of geochemical factors. Pond 3, it comes back down a little because another AMD source comes in at about pH 6.03. And from there, it just works its way. Pond 6 and 7 are the wetlands, and 8 is actually the effluent, the spillway coming out of the final wetland. So the pH by the final treatment pond spillway is about 6.65, I believe, is what we were at. And the DO, so the DO, obviously, these are supposed to be oxic beds. So I was very concerned about entraining oxygen into the water column and actually seeing increases in the concentrations. First couple beds, it kind of struggles. I mean, the AMD's coming in at a DO of 2.7 or so, and the second one's coming in at just over 1 milligram per liter. And then the oxidation reaction isn't exactly rapid. It takes a little time. So first few beds were 5 to 6 milligram per liter, and as we get farther down the treatment system, we start getting up around 8 milligrams per liter. But on the bottom here, it's a very busy table because I was running calcs. I got 2 iron samples. I got an iron sample for pond 3 and an iron sample from the pond 7 effluent spillway. Pond 3 was at 14 part per million. The effluent spillway was at 8. And I did this with a Hawk field testing kit while hosting an unrelated meeting. So it was kind of quick and dirty. And then I back calculated the rate constant to try to predict what type of reductions we would have seen in each pond to get us to an 8 by the final spillway. And that's kind of how this whole thing came about. And this is still a work in progress because I think there's a lot of minor adjustments we could make out here that would considerably improve performance. So I run through about 3 scenarios where, let me just do this one real quick. Take into consideration that the data I just showed represents a 40% load reduction. It was collected with a Hawk field testing kit during an unrelated meeting, only between ponds 3 and 7. It doesn't include any reductions in ponds 1 and 2. The discharge rate on that particular day exceeded any historical average or maximum, all but one maximum we'd ever seen. The treatment system has been reduced in size by 80%, and the client went out a few days later and actually measured a 60% load reduction starting at pond 1. And the calculations I used to estimate my rate constant and predict some variables was the abiotic homogeneous iron oxidation equation. And I had done a little work with the heterogeneous equation because that's better for the 6 to 7 pH range, but I was running into a couple issues with how much of that ferric iron that was converted is still dissolved in the water column and how much is precipitated as a solid. Plus, I had a couple instances where I was seeing increases in ferrous before it dropped off. So I got to play with the equation a little more. And I estimated my K, my rate constant, to match the empirical data from the field. Typically, I'd use the Arrhenius equation, which is a temperature-influenced rate constant, so that I could predict my iron oxidation rates. But here, I didn't do that because I already knew what was coming in and going out. I fit the data to it. Then I ran some scenarios. So theoretical increase of dissolved oxygen to 100% saturation. We'd increase our load reductions from about 40 to 49%. And I was concerned. At first I go out there, I put a DO probe in, I'm getting 5.5, 6 milligrams per liter. I'm thinking, why aren't we at 8? Why aren't we at 9? Why aren't we at 100% saturation? Maybe it's because the iron's consuming it. Maybe it's because the AMD's coming in with such low iron that it's just taking time to oxidize. But after I ran the numbers, I thought there's plenty of oxygen in there. 1 milligram of iron only requires 0.143 milligrams of dissolved oxygen. So we'd only need about 2 milligrams per liter of oxygen to oxidize the existing ferrous iron concentration. So I wasn't exactly concerned after that. Okay, slight increase in oxygen, slight increase in oxidation rate and load reduction. Now I looked at retention time. This one had a little bit more of an influence. So theoretical increase of retention time by 100%, double, which would be like to halve your flow rate, increases iron removal from 40 to 72%, which we may actually observe during the low flow season. And this falls back to the theoretical calculations where we kind of set the precedent that changing conditions, changing load reductions. Currently, there is less retention time due to we built smaller ponds than what we had originally proposed. We had to make adjustments to accommodate various engineering and landowner concerns and items. And the discharge on the day I did these measurements was 550 gallon per minute, which was near double, maybe even double, the theoretical flow condition of 272 where we ran all the proposed theoretical calculations. And then finally, this is the big one, was pH. If we could get the pH up to 6.8, we would increase iron removal rates from 40% to 87%. And the initial concentrations of the pH from the AMD sources and the ALD, they were recently around 6.2 when we were sampling in 2022 and we were looking at the data from the years up till then. But more recently, they were discharging a 5.98, 6.03. Now, it's only a 0.2 unit decrease. As you're all aware, each tenth of a unit is like exponentially larger in iron oxidation capacity due to the rate constant equation. So every little adjustment to pH has a substantial effect on how rapidly iron oxidizes. But fortunately, even with these low pHs coming in, there is residual alkalinity in the treatment system, and we are seeing pHs of 6.2 to 6.7 in the ponds themselves, even though the AMD sources aren't that alkaline. Well, they're alkaline, but their pHs were lower than I had originally measured. So one of the things we're going to do here is additional chemical assessment, some water quality sampling for AMD parameters, and sampling for dissolved inorganic carbon. I've been talking with a few people about this very collaboratively, about what do you think it is? What could we do to bump those pHs up and get a little bit more iron oxidation out there? And a lot of people had suggested the fact that we got, a lot of water coming out of an underground flooded mine pool, low oxygen running through an ALD. There's probably a lot of carbon dioxide in that water. If we could exhaust some of that off, we might be in a better position pH-wise. And then take some more discharge measurements, calculate some load calculations, compare them to historical data, run the data analysis under heterogeneous iron conditions, refine the oxidation rate, run the statistical analysis I talked about, and possibly even implement some modifications, aeration, agitation, maybe even additional alkaline reagent, another limestone bed. That may not even be necessary, though. As we go through the seasonal variation, we might see just naturally load reductions increase and conditions change. We were in the high flow season when this was done. So that's all the chemical aspects, and there's just a couple final little details. As we ran one of these dosing siphons, these self-flushing fluid dynamic dosing siphons, I've used them a few times. I typically like them. This was the smallest treatment bed I ever used it on, and one of the things I didn't like is, I like the pond fills and flushes, but this pond's so small, it flushes every 45 minutes. When it fills, I'd actually like that water to sit in there for a little while, and it can't because it triggers a flush. But it's all right. It's an alkaline system anyway. I could live with that. But it functioned for the first several weeks, and then more recently, it's experiencing trickle mode, as the personnel over at Fluid Dynamic Siphons describes it. Basically, the flush initiates, but it does not stop. And the siphon doesn't reset to allow the pond to fill again. Now, you could put a pump in there, pump the pond down, and reset the siphon. Pond fills back up in 45 minutes, it flushes again, and then it trickles. Most likely, it's because the inflow exceeds the outflow capacity. So we sized the pump or the siphon on historic data. On the very bottom of that table, it shows that when it initiates a flush, you got about 900 GPM coming out, and its low flow rate is 450. So if you got water coming in at greater than 450, that siphon can't reset. But in all the data that had been collected in 22 years, we'd never seen a flow over 450 except one, which I'll show you at the very beginning. This, if it plays, I will see if it plays. This, I just happened to be there during construction on one of the days. Let's see here. We're probably not going to have any luck with it because they had mentioned that this isn't actually PowerPoint. It's a PowerPoint-like program, but it might not recognize this. All that happened was the dosing siphon flushed in this video, and it doesn't look like 900 GPM. I mean, I know it's hard to gauge a discharge rate from a flowing pipe, but 900 is pretty powerful. And this came out like, maybe a few hundred. One interesting thing is by the end of this video, there's a huge iron plume that starts to circulate around in that basin and accumulate behind that baffle. And really, the settling zone is beyond that baffle, but when the water level gets higher, the metals will continue to convey down the treatment practice. This was based on a piece of literature from the Western Agricultural Journal about using two baffle systems with a settling zone in between. I used it on another passive treatment system in Westmoreland County, PA, and it's been reasonably effective. I've seen substantial metals accumulation in the zone of settling between the two baffles, but video won't play. I could live with that as well, but we'll take a quick look at the flow rates and how they probably affect this dosing siphon function. From 98 to 24, all the discharge rates were below 450. In 22, when we were first invited to the site, we did two discharge measurements, and they were like 380 and 430, and that was kind of an eye-opener that it was the highest flow rates that had been seen since 98. We measured them in 22, but we were out there in the wet season. And we thought, well, they still fall within that range of all the other measurements. They're a little higher, but they're still less than 450. We can use an 8-inch model 836 dosing siphon. We've never exceeded 450, except for one outlier there in 1998. If you look at the statistical interpretation, even the 90th percentile flow isn't even close to 450. But the day we did the analysis post-construction, it was flowing at 550. And there's some belief that it's potentially related to the disturbance to the refuse in the borough area, that we're putting more water into this treatment system now than what had originally been going into it. So that brings us to the additional water sources. This is an ISO patch of the grading plan for the site. You can see the treatment ponds, the red, orange, and yellow areas, especially red and orange. Those were the borough areas of the refuse and spoil that had been reclaimed back in 97. More importantly, on the lower right side of this, the excavation depths were 10 to 12 feet, and the contour had varied from what had originally been there and could very possibly have affected the subsurface hydrology and is putting more water over into the treatment system now. Now, we don't know that. It could very well have just been an atypically wet spring. I know there were a couple 100-year storm events around the area. I know Westmoreland County got crushed by a 100-year storm event. Turtle Creek was out of its banks, and it's incised 15, 18 feet deep. The stream bed, the culverts are that tall, and it was out of its banks. So maybe it was just a wet season. Maybe we affected subsurface hydrology. Maybe it'll stabilize as the months and years go by. And one final item, just unrelated to the dosing siphon, is we'd spec some aerobic wetlands as the final two treatment practices. And you can see them under construction, putting the compost and baffles in. But the picture on the right, you may notice there's very little vegetation in there. This is supposed to be vegetated berm to berm, inflow to outflow. And what we have is a little lateral bar of cattail. And what had actually been specced in there is a thick assemblage of native grasses and shrubs. So it turns into like a carpet, a mat. And if you could get that carpet of native grasses to grow in there, you'll see substantial removal of total suspended solids. We got away from the cattails a long time ago, and I actually had gotten away from on the recommendation of Brent Means and Brad Schultz when they used to host the AMD treat trainings years ago. They said, quit using cattails, focus on thick grasses. That's what really filters your solids. So I think we need to do a little work in here. We've got to get a little more compost in here, do some grading, get some vegetative establishment, and I think we'll see larger load reductions of our precipitated component. So in summary, the biggest takeaway from this was that we changed treatment methodologies. We switched from compost BMPs to oxic BMPs with a few alkaline generating steps and aerobic wetlands along the way. We had an approximate 40% load reduction, but the client measured 60% in a treatment that had been a system that had been reduced by 80% in size during a measured flow that was 2.5 times or 2 times the median and 1.5 times the 90th percentile flow with an inflow pH a couple tenths of a unit below what we'd seen historically. And the landowner regained considerable acreage for livestock grading. And really, like I said many slides ago, the landowner was the driving force for this refurbishment. If he hadn't wanted to get rid of those ponds, the client would have been fine with allowing them to continue to function at 40 to 50% capacity. And the project's not complete. This was all collected, photos taken, data analyzed while the contractor was still on site working in the ponds. The site's going to require time to normalize to the new conditions. We're still developing monitoring approaches, maintenance approaches. We have a site meeting with the client October 20th to do a more detailed analysis. So instead of grabbing samples with a hot kit while I'm holding a meeting, we're actually out there to analyze the system. So by end of the month, we should have much more data that I have much more faith in its accuracy. And that we expect improvements as the treatment approach is dialed in, environmental conditions vary, and the site stabilizes and revegetates. So thank you for your time.
We have about 5 minutes for questions. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask? What was the funding source for this?
It was a state-funded project. Honestly, I mean, I'll tell you who the client was. I didn't clear it with them, but it's only because we're still in construction. But it was the state DEP, West Virginia DEP. So it was an AML project. Yeah, but they're happy with it too. So I don't think they'd mind me saying that.
So those ALDs, the pipes you have, they're open. Are they actual ALDs? Are they still flooded?
You mean like fully saturated ALD? Yeah. I guess they are flooded to the water elevation coming out of the pipe. Unless it backed up behind the pipe, like you have more head behind the pipe pushing water through the pipe. But we didn't analyze them. I mean, that was really one of the early conversations we had is
your pipes going in the pond are not flooded.
Fully.
There's no air cat or like water gas trap on the end or anything. So
no, there's not.
Okay. And why? So if you 300 alkalinity, why did you leave limestone bed?
Well, I don't think it was 300. I got to look back at that. I think it was more like maybe 120, 130, and then the acid generation rate for metal precipitation was going to put like metals acidity was like around, I don't know what it was, like 80 or 100. There was slightly more alkalinity than acidity, which is net alkaline. But it was such a close threshold that we thought, what if we see iron oxidation? What if we see pH depression? And we don't do anything to boost it back up. So it was more like a fail-safe, like what do you call it, like a margin of safety, of 2 instead of 0. Just, let's throw an alkaline generating step in there. And what we did see was pH actually not skyrocketed, but increased gradually coming out of limestone bed through the next practices. And is that just because the metals are beginning to peter out and the acid generation has been neutralized? Or is that because we added extra alkalinity from the limestone bed? I don't know. But we're going out on October 20th and we're doing a detailed water quality sampling. And we'll be able to kind of hone some of these features and characteristics that we've observed. We've observed them, but we don't fully understand why.
And it'd be cool to see how that compares to AMD treat, because in my experience with AMD treat, does a pretty poor job predicting iron removal and iron accumulation in this like good treatment train.
Is that the old version or the new version? I just learned how to use the new version on Tuesday, and I can't wait to run this. Okay, well, I'm gonna have to reach out to you, Ben.
Probably time for one or two more questions of this.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, often when you size a passive treatment system and make it smaller, what you're sacrificing is maintenance intervals. Like you're shortening the maintenance interval because you can't accommodate metals. How many years of sludge accumulation can it accommodate? So you have to clean it out.
I don't know.
Okay.
No, I could run the numbers and calculate what kind of volume of iron precipitate, at like 1% solids, 5% solids. How long would it take to fill the bottom 1 foot of the ponds? Because that's what we talked about with the state. What maintenance interval do they want? Do they want to be out here every 6 months, every year, every 5 years? They actually intend to have a pretty intensive maintenance cycle on this ever since they started getting the IIJA money. They've hired a lot of people. They're doing more maintenance on their passive treatment sites. That's why we're still developing a treatment approach and a monitoring approach, a monitoring approach and a maintenance approach. One of the meetings I had out there was to describe to them where to sample. One of the next meetings we're having with them out there is to lay out a maintenance cycle, how regular they need to be out there. A lot of the features you saw were like the rip-wrapped berms and the rip-wrap bottom. A lot of times you just see like a bare liner, but they actually wanted, we used a geosynthetic liner, which I think also could affect how much water is really coming in from the refuse and spoil. But the state thinks a lot of that water is not coming into the ponds from the disturbed refuse. It's getting into the ALDs and the outlet pipes. So it's actually coming from the pipes, not from the groundwater, but it's from the disturbance. But the point is those liners with the rock over them, that was their recommendation because they said they're sick of getting in these oxic beds and tearing the liners apart when they excavate their solids. So it was their recommendation to put 6 or 8 inches of like ASHTO 1 or 3, I forget what we put in there, to basically protect the layer. So a lot of the features you see were their recommendation. And as far as maintenance cycles for sludge removal, still got to run the numbers. I'll use AMD Treat version 6.0, see what it tells me.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Everyone for participating in today's session. Please remember to fill out your surveys, and we have reached our time, and feel free to, if you want to hear Stacy back, to stay in this room. The river presentation is in ballroom 1. I think there was a duplication
Very good.
of Stacy's, she was listed for this room and the other room, so she'll be in this room.